Girls, welcome to your dedicated improvement and reflection time. You should use this close analysis of the mark scheme to redraft your Christmas mock and submit on Showbie before the 4th of January. Read through these, pause now, and understand why I have put these little moments together for you. So these are some of the Instagram moments. So I have snapshotted this little paragraph to show you the confidence of learning, the difference that it makes whenever you put in the facts and you have a very specific context reviewed in the paragraph. Pause it now and have a closer read at that. So I've captured some Instagram moments for you. You can pause here, read through them and use them to improve your own work. So here I have screenshotted this because it just shows you the confidence when you use factual, learned information. Doesn't it read so much better? I've included these Instagram moments as well to show you the precision of the analysis here, the focus on the little things that make the difference and the precise explanation about Heeny's father afterwards. I've also included this one so that you can see AO3, how a little connection between both poems is better than using a big long paragraph where you get lost in it. Again, I've used these two little snapshots. I mean, they're not perfect, but they do show at least a level of analysis maybe that some of you just did not achieve. Very precise analysis of the ellipsis here. And I think what I like about this one as well is that it's a very simple connection between the poems. It focuses on the language and it moves on quite quickly on to the next connection. So just a word about introductions, please. Facts and dates are essential to create a good impression. You have to show the knowledge of the different eras from which these poems were taken. You must not call them poems. Call them sonnets if they're sonnets. Call them lyrics if they're lyrics. Make a quick thematic link to another poem. Add in some context if it is relevant. And answer the question. Here's an example. A little word about introductions, folks. We talked about these in class. You do need to rewrite your introductions. As I've shown you, facts and dates are essential. You must use the form of the poem. You must make a thematic link. You can use context if it is relevant to the question. And of course, you must keep focused on the question. Take your time when you're writing your introduction, please. Some of them are very sloppy and created a very poor impression for the examiner. So Clearances is a deconstructed sonnet. It is not a Petrarchan sonnet. It is a deconstructed Petrarchan sonnet. I've indicated here the fact that this is a modern poet. It is not an elegy. In your notes it says it is an elegiac memorial to his mother. Put her name in. It creates a better impression. Show that you understand that this is an extract from a longer poem. And show that you know that he is a modern poet. Make a reference to his style. It isn't a gushy poem. It's very unsentimental but very clear. It's not just about himself. It is about her capturing the moment of her death, but also it explores his family's feelings immediately after her passing. The metaphor of a clearance is a complex one that is developed towards the end of the poem. You want to try and make 1 or 2 sentences to connect the other poem. using the sonnet, and obviously it's used in a more traditional way because it has an octave and a sestet and a volta, a regular rhyming scheme, mostly regular rhyming scheme, and uses the iambic pentameter. It's written in the Victorian era, so again, we're showing the difference between the two poems in terms of when they were written. And we're highlighting the biggest difference in the introduction, which is the fact that this one is written from the perspective of the dying speaker. We can say that this one uses more formal and archaic language, that there's more regularity of rhyme, and that this poem centres more about her message to those left behind. Moment in his life. Here's an example. And again, I'm highlighting to you where I am scoring marks in terms of the assessment objectives. So first of all, you need the terminology. All right, it is a deconstructed Petrarchan sonnet. It is an elegiac memorial to his mother. The central technique that is used in this poem is the complex metaphor of the clearance. Remember is more traditional in its use of the sonnet form. It's more formal in terms of its language. It's more regular in terms of its rhyme and its rhythm. Obviously, as well, I'm using factual learned details. The Hall Lantern, 1987. He's a modern poet. She wrote in the Victorian era. So I'm clearly stating the facts of the context of each of the poems. I'm also then referencing the style of the poem. Heaney uses this unsentimental clarity. It is not a gushy poem. He is bringing alive the final moments of her death. Now that's a fact about the content of the poem that needed to be made clear in your introduction. He is exploring his family's feelings immediately after her passing. Rossetti instead is capturing the conflicting emotions from the perspective of the dying speaker. The poem centres more on a message that she wants to leave to her listener. A word of advice now on writing about tone, attitudes and feelings. Don't be afraid to simply write about the feelings that each poet conveys. I mean, we're dealing with the theme of death. So it's funny that there isn't, like on My First Son, a real outpouring, and you can sense from Ben Jonson's speaking voice that he is in turmoil, he's in anguish, he is grieving really powerfully within the poem. But these two poems are slightly more restrained in terms of their tone. So they explore, Heaney in particular explores the feelings of his father, and also he shows us at the end of the poem how his family unit has changed, and the feelings of realisation and the change in his family's identity is explored at the end of the poem. Tone needs to be linked to specific quotations. Otherwise, you are speaking about feelings. Please use your tone list to help you write about tone more effectively. This might have been a better way to open the paragraph. Each poet explores a range of feelings and conflicting attitudes towards the experience of death and dying. You can see here that the tone is labelled. A tone of awe and fear is palpable when he says, "It penetrated clearances that suddenly stood open." The reader senses his understanding of the momentum. A word of advice on writing about the tone and attitudes and feelings. Here would have been a very simple way to write a paragraph on the feelings explored in the poem. Each poet explores a range of feelings and conflicting attitudes towards the experience of death and dying. Do not confuse tone with feelings. This is an emotive theme to capture in poetry. So, the speakers in both of these poems are experiencing different feelings. When you're writing about the tone needs to be linked to a specific quotation. Tone is a product of a line. You hear the tone. Tone is something that is audible and hearable, whereas a poet can just be feeling regret, loneliness, and is kind of exploring those feelings through the recreation of the poem. Pause for a moment here and really consider what AO1 is all about. AO1, I could tell straight away, was whenever I looked at your plans. And most of you don't need to plan the first section of your essay, the content, the attitudes, and the structure section. You know what's in there. But in order to get the connections and the links, you needed to have put a little bit more thought into where the imagery connected up, where the language connected up, exactly what it was about the openings that you could connect or contrast. The argument needed to be developed into a series of shorter paragraphs so that you could focus on elaborating on the links that you had planned to write about. Most of you simply took too long to get to the language, techniques and imagery section. There was a great deal of waffle in the first half of those essays. Obviously, this is still a major issue with regard to some of your writing. A lot of your writing is still not competent. Sentences, punctuation, commas, the way that you integrate and use punctuation to delineate your quotational usage needs an incredible amount of work, and that is something that you need to do whenever you are rewriting your essay. Shorter quotations need to be integrated. Longer quotations should be heralded by a colon. New lines, as in when the poet takes a new line, needs to be indicated by a /. And punctuation has to be used in exactly the same way that the poet uses it within your quotations. We talked about the importance of topic sentences. Topic sentences are crucial. They're essential to show that you are making a reasoned and developed response to the question. That involves planning, and also it means that you need to make sure that what you're quoting and the points that you're making are relevant. In terms of AO1 then, you can see here that it is graduated. This was a major issue, the level of accuracy in the written expression, the spelling, punctuation, grammar, and overall the coherence of the response. That means one paragraph leading into the next paragraph into the next. Most people were fine at the beginning, the introduction. People spent too long on the next paragraph instead of delving straight into the analysis of the structure and form. After the structure and form paragraph, the essay kind of disintegrated, and that was due to planning. I could see from the front of your pages that you really hadn't thought through the connections that you were going to make from then to the end of the page, to the end of the essay. So a lot of this is to do with the planning. A lot of it as well is to do with the topic sentences that are going to indicate the connections that you're going on to explore. There are some issues still with quotation. First of all, the level of quotation that was being used. I guarantee if some of you went back to highlight the number of quotations that you actually used in your essay, you would not be highlighting anything. So that's the first thing. Shorter quotations should be integrated into the sentence. Never, ever begin a sentence with a quotation. Longer quotations should be heralded by a colon. They should be quoted exactly as they are in the poem. No excuses, because you have the poem on the page in front of you. New lines, as the poet takes them, should be indicated by a /. Go back and have a look at model work in your Shobi. There's some absolutely dire spelling, punctuation and grammar, and some of you will need to create pages of your own mistakes. There are what I call unpardonable sins in this kind of writing. So I will be asking to see what you have done about the things that I have corrected. The apostrophe, please. This is one poet's use of alliteration. the apostrophe placed after the S shows that it is both poets' use of alliteration. The apostrophe before and after the S shows singular ownership and plural ownership. I'm putting up a link to a YouTube PowerPoint or presentation that I use with my junior classes to help you understand the apostrophe. There are other unforgivable errors, and you just need to make sure not to repeat them in the essay that you submit in January. There are what I call some unpardonable sins, most of which are related to spelling and to grammar. The apostrophe is still an issue. There are some things, though, that you can learn. Here, the poet's use of. It belongs to the poet, so it's a singular ownership before the S. Here, the apostrophe after the S indicates that it is both poets' use of alliteration. Poets, plural. You can see here as well some of the more common spelling mistakes. Think of the word arc in Petrarch, and so that should be the names of poems go inside inverted commas, and the names of the poems should be capitalised, and clearances is spelt with an A. Names of poems go inside inverted commas. Names of poems should be capitalised. Clearances is spelt with an A. Think of the arc in Petrarchan. At this point, some of you do need to create your own spelling, punctuation and grammar folder. You need to start writing out the mistakes and the words that you are having trouble with, phrases on a page that you can learn. I will be asking to see those as we move throughout the year. Your second assessment objective is form and language. I'm not going to say too much on the structure and the form because you just need to go back to your notes and see the level of technical detail that many of you neglected to learn. You need to make more meaningful and detailed comments on the stylistic devices. The difference between poetic devices and stylistic devices here is that the poetic devices are linked to techniques that are used specifically with poetry. Those are linked to the structure of the poem, the rhyme, the rhythm, the pentameter, or the meter, the enjambment, the caesura. Those are specific to poetry, and they should be included as relevant when you are speaking about the form and the structure. The stylistic devices and the critical vocabulary that you need is whenever you look at the linguistic and literary devices, archaic language, metaphor, simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, the sound techniques that can be used both in prose and poetry, but they are to do with the style of the poet. So this needs definitely a lot more careful learning and attention. Go back to your notes, please. And again, you can't make meaningful comments on the stylistic devices without connecting or contrasting it to the other poem. AO2 then, form and language, is the next area. First of all, here I want to make a comment on how well you understood the content of the poems. Some of you do not understand your poems. You may have thought you understood them when you looked at them with your notes, but I think now when you come to evaluate your understanding of those poems, some of you should realise that you did not understand the content of those poems. There's a lesson here. You know, you're sitting in class, you're thinking you're understanding it. You will probably have to do a little bit more writing to make sure that you understand the premise, the intentions behind the creation of each of the poems that you have in your collection. Use your notes, use your links on Shobi. Do not underestimate the amount of study that understanding the content of these poems will take. Okay, so as I've indicated here then, this is your analysis of the shape and the layout of the poem. The poetic devices include rhyme, rhythm, caesura, couplet, octave, sestet, that should be. And the overall visual appearance of the poetry on the page. In particular, I'm thinking of a poem like I Carry Your Heart, which is immediately modern and unique on the page, indicating a more contemporary style of poetry. Here then, AO2 is also about the structure and the form, and the poetic techniques, which are the rhyme, the rhythm, the caesura, the enjambment, the sestet, the octave, the technical terminology that is associated with the writing of poetry. Some of these issues were unforgivable. You were warned time and time again to make sure that you had learned your structure and your form off by heart and inside and out. Some of you learned very little, and I think now that you will understand the level of detail and the level of technicality that you need to use in order to get into these two top mark bands. Just to be clear, when you go back to look at your structural notes, these were some or all of the things that I think could have been included within that paragraph on the structure of clearances. When you look at this kind of terminology, you need to assess whether you included this or not. The repeated D sound within the rhyme scheme of the poem was clearly explained in your class notes and in the additional notes that were up on Shobi. I didn't want this neglected. This is central to the way he explores his feelings about death and recreates that moment of her death. Here were the things I wanted to check off your paragraph in terms of clearances. A modern adaptation of Petrarchan, iambic rhythms and the line lengths reflect the cadences and patterns of human speech. The octave was roughly ending midline where the volta occurred. I was looking to see your analysis of that very important caesural pause. I needed to see how the sestet then became more elegaic. I needed to see your analysis of those climactic end stopped lines. Most disappointing was the lack of learning with regard to the repeated D sound in the rhyme scheme, which was extremely pertinent to this particular question, and obviously lots of lack of learning, or half learning as I call it, when you were looking at the rhyme scheme of your poems. This, as I said, indicated before, is your ability to analyse the poet's style, the language and the imagery that they choose to use, the literary techniques that they choose to explore, that they use to explore the themes. This needs to be grounded in quotation. Moving down into this assessment objective, then you are supposed to be looking at the stylistic devices. This was probably the bit where your timing came into play and your lack of planning came into play. Stylistic devices are the types of language used, the words and phrases that you were quoting from each of the poems, the links that you are making in terms of the techniques that are used, the similes, the metaphors, the onomatopoeia, alliteration, sibilants, the plosive sounds. This was by far the biggest problem area in the essay. So this is what I want you to focus on when you are redrafting your essays. So how could I have compared the literary techniques in clearances? A simple way would have been to take the opening couple of lines and to look at the technique used and the style of the opening couple of lines. Look at the words and phrases the poet chooses to use. Again, there's very accurate notes in your Shobi folders for this. You could have compared the creation of the voices in the poems. Slightly different tone of voice, slightly different language being used there. You could have compared the style of the language used, the modern language, the modern Northern Irish vernacular used within the poem clearances versus the more archaic diction and phrasing of the Victorian sonnet of Rossetti. The comparison of the epigrammatic endings, in any of those poems needed the level of detail and close analysis that we would have gone through in class. What could I have done to make sure that I do address the stylistic techniques used in both poems? Compare the openings, but don't compare the content. Look at the methods used to open those poems. Look at the speaking voice. Look at the kind of language, the phrasing used within the poems. Pick quotations that allow you to connect the poems together. If you're looking at the language, again, a lot of the poems that you used to contrast with clearances were very early poems. So obviously there's going to be a great level of difference in terms of the diction. You know, there is a lot of modern referencing in the clearances poem because the poet is trying to use and create the sound of the Northern Irish speaking voice. It is autobiographical for him. So especially there when he's recreating the voice of his father, that would have allowed you to look at how the words that he uses help to convey the awkwardness and the discomfort of the father in this moment of death. And then you've got some very archaic diction and more formal phrasing in some of the other poems that you chose to use. A lot more biblical referencing and connotations. Again, this is where you're allowed to use, or where you should be using, your knowledge of the context of the poems in order to enhance your analysis of the language choices. Unforgivably, the endings of the poems were not analysed in sufficient detail. When you look at the level of detail analysis that we did on the last 4 lines of clearances, look back at your work. Some of you shied entirely away from looking at the level of complexity of those final few lines. Some of you just went into exploring the image in a very general way, but did not go to that close analysis of techniques that were used in order to get into that top band. AO3 then is your comparisons, you know, and I just think the timing was a real issue here. Planning and thinking was an issue. You know, I would have expected after your structure and form paragraph about 6 paragraphs of little links developed. And with that, you needed to have started in your planning stages to create a list and to really try and physically link those poems together. Here's an example of what I mean here. In the final couplet, Rossetti uses antonomical or antonyms to forget, remember, smile and sad, to contrast and give the poem memorability. Heaney also uses unusual pairings of words together in his last line, pure and change. These words add emphasis on how life after grief is extremely different for the family, but could also be cleansing. Now, again, that would have needed a little bit more explanation as to why Rossetti wanted to create this memorability. Again, it's ironic because the main message of her poet is for her partner to forget her and to think fondly of her. This is ironic because, in a way, she is highlighting the passivity of women in the Victorian era, and she certainly does not want to be forgotten as a female poet who struggled to gain a place within a very male-dominated patriarchal literary circle. She certainly wanted to be remembered, and the success of that poem is that she is remembered for that poem. Again, this whole idea of a pure change happening, not just for Heaney, but for the family, is that there's a realisation that life will be very different for this family now, that there will be a change in identity for Heaney, an identity without the family unit that he was always used to. AO3, the comparisons. I mean, most people were making some relevant comparisons and contrasts, but after the structure and form paragraph, the essay kind of disintegrated. So you need to plan 4 or 5 very specific links that you can make and try to create a more synthesized approach whenever you are analysing the language and the imagery and the literary techniques used within the poems. Here's a very simple example here. I mean, this could have been developed in a little bit more depth of detail, but at least she's focusing on a particular technique. All right, the unusual, the choice of words, forget, remember, smile and sad, or antonyms, they create this memorability. Again, memorability was important for Christina Rossetti because her intention as well was to create a legacy of her own poetic work. She was, and the irony is that she is now being studied and she is remembered long after her own death because of the very epigrammatic and easily remembered lines in that sonnet. Heaney then also chooses unusual words in his last, very emphatic end-stopped line. Pure and change is the example that this pupil uses. Again, I would have expected a little bit more interpretation of what she meant by cleansing. So, context. And again, you can see in the graduated mark scheme here that your response is supposed to be enriched by the use of contextual material. So this is where you use the context to help you explain what the lines or the quotations mean to you. You know, it was unforgivable for you not to mention that this poem was written in an era where there was a cult of mourning, where death was actually an occasion, and that was inspired by the death of Queen Victoria's husband, wasn't it? So go back, take a look at your notes there. I've also, if you want to pause it here, that you can see there, I have written out a little sample there for you. In terms of the context here, you just need to pause. You need to go back, you need to review, you need to be much more specific in the way that you use your context. You know, not to show your understanding of Christina Rossetti's time period and the Victorian cult of mourning was unforgivable. A lot of you were writing about her criticisms of the patriarchal society, but not necessarily linking it to the theme of death. All right, so I've reworded this here for you. You can pause it here and read that over again to see how to make it more relevant to the title. Again, comparing the contexts of each poem is a great way to hit AO3 as well as AO4. So, for example, by contrast, there seems to be no veiled message about death in Heaney's poem. In Heaney's poem, he is more shockingly honest in his portrayal of the deathbed scene between his parents. There is no veiled message or criticism of society within this poem. That is one of the links and one of the contrasts in the content and the context of each of these poems. You can pause this here. You know, these aren't perfect, but at least it shows an element of learning and an attempt to apply the context of each of the poems to enhance the analysis of those poems. So please read this and see how you could use the same kind of information. So what are my targets for improvement? You need to really consider which or maybe all of these targets that you need to address. I want to see at least a grade improvement in the next draft that you provide for me on Shobi. Good luck. I'll take any questions in January, just not over Christmas. And if you're wise, you should try and get this out of the way before next Wednesday. That would be the best place whenever it's fresh in your mind. Good luck.